Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University.
I'm Stuart McErlain-Naylor. In this sports performance episode, I'll be talking to Professor Mark King from Loughborough University about 19 years of elite cricket bowling biomechanics research. We'll talk through performance, injuries and legality of bowling, as well as what the future has in store. Hi Mark, welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast.
Hi Stuart, it's a pleasure to be here. I feel on the other foot after supervise your PhD. Now you're grilling me with some questions.
Yeah, I couldn't pass up the opportunity to get some revenge after all these years. I think to start with, obviously I'm aware peripherally of a lot of the stuff you've been doing in cricket, but you've been involved in cricket bowling biomechanics research alongside the England and Wales Cricket Board for about 19 years, I think we just worked out. So briefly, could you just give a bit of an overview of that journey and some of the experiences you've had along the way?
Yeah, I think I feel very lucky to be sat here because I was the fortunate person who put their hand up when the ECB approached us back in 2004. Troy Cooley was the fast bowling coach and he said, we're used to getting some biomechanics support. We're based now at Loughborough. Who can do it? And I'd played cricket in the past. Others in the group hadn't. So I said yes. And then all these years later, we have a very, embedded collaboration. The journey, it's changed over the period from a focus on injuries when we first started, because lots of the bowlers were getting stress fractures, through to performance with a new head coach, Kevin Shine, and then more recently has come back to injuries. Everything that can happen has probably happened over the years, from cameras falling off tripods to cricket balls hitting cameras and everything in between. Plus we had Boris as well in the lab a few years ago. So it's been a really exciting journey, sometimes tough, banning bowlers for chucking. We have an accredited centre here. But overall, it's been very much a collaboration, I would say, with the ECB. They're an organisation that use research very effectively to try and answer questions and move the understanding forwards. And it's been a pleasure to be part of that relationship over the years.
Okay, so lots of interesting experiences, but you mentioned you'd played a bit of cricket, the ECB got in touch. What was that like? How did that start out? What was the very early steps and the first studies you did?
Well, it started off being a consultancy project because they didn't know us and we didn't really know them. And so it was a small project, no real commitment to provide reports, really profiling of some of their bowlers. And so we did that, and it was very general at that point because the knowledge base from what we'd done was very small, and all the work primarily come out of Australia. And the mixed action was talked about all the time, and the focus was on injuries. And Craig Ranson was one of the physios involved. He was based over in Derby at that point, and he was doing his PhD out of Curtin University. And so we contributed to that project and worked with him. And so it went from consultancy to contributing to an already funded PhD in the first instance. But it was quite general at that point because we understood biomechanics, but we didn't really understand fast bowling at the beginning.
Okay, so if we start with performance, I'll go with the big headline question to start with, and then we might be able to unpick it a bit more. But based on everything you've done, how do people bowl as fast as possible?
Well, fast bowling is a nice, simple activity because at face value, the bowler wants to bowl fast. And obviously there's far more to it, and swing and seam and deception and etc. and different length deliveries. But the first question was, how do you bowl fast? And so Pete Worthington did a nice experimental study, taking a cohort of elite fast bowlers, and the ECB were very good to give us access to the very best bowlers in the country. So Andrew Flintoff, Steve Harmison, etc. were all part of that study and said, well, what do the best do? And, in England, and can we, look at that data and say, is there something that they all do? And that's what biomechanics is about at one level, is understanding what good looks like. And are there some common features? And at the elite end, the answer is yes, there are. So there are a series of factors that the vast majority of elite fast bowlers do. And, we can talk about what they are specifically if you want, but it's, but every bowler's different. And I think that's the important thing to say here is there isn't one way to bowl fast. That's very clear, but there are some common attributes that all fast bowlers do. So they all run up, and we know what the sort of optimal run-up speed is on average, and then there'll be some small deviations around that. Fundamentally, you have to apply force to the ball to make it accelerate and go fast. So there are a couple of different ways you can apply force to the ball, but fundamentally it's the contical impulse. You either apply a high force over a short period of time or a lower force over a longer period of time in its simplistic form. And bowlers do that by delaying their bowling arm. And then that conversion of the run-up into speed comes by a brace front leg. And so you use the run-up to bowl fast. So it's not like baseball pitching where they're stationary and all the speed and momentum comes from the throwing action itself. So, bowling uses a run-up and you convert that momentum into speed.
To ask a potentially stupid question then, why can't they just run up as fast as possible, or why don't we convert 100-metre runners into cricket bowlers?
Well, I think Usain Bolt was claimed to be a good fast bowler at one point, and I'm sure 100-metre runners could be if they had the skill. But time's an important element. I think you can run up too fast, a bit like long jumping or high jumping. If you run up too fast, you'll collapse. Your body can't cope with that momentum. So, fast bowlers don't sprint up, but equally they don't jog up either, and it's somewhere in between. So if you looked at a fast bowler versus a long jumper's almost sprinting flat out, and probably is at flat out, whereas a fast bowler isn't, but equally he's not jogging up either.
And is there an element of control there around what would go wrong if they did run up too fast, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, the most likely thing to happen is their front leg would collapse. So you'd run up, you'd try and stop. Essentially, one of the most surprising things that came when you looked at fast bowling in more detail is where at front foot contact, their front leg almost stops, or it appears to stop, the hip. So there's a huge reaction force from the ground and loading on the body, which I'm sure we'll come on to. But if you run up too fast, the body can't cope with that, and it will ultimately collapse. So it's very similar to if you compared high jumping to long jumping. High jumpers don't run up at flat out speed, whereas long jumpers pretty much do.
Mm-hmm. And if that's run up, plant the leg, you've spoken a lot about the brace knee, etc. There's a lot that can still go wrong or a lot that can still go right between the leg and the ball. So, what do they do? You mentioned everyone's different, but there are certain commonalities or certain things that the elite all seem to do. What does the upper body look like during that action?
So the bit we haven't mentioned is the trunk. So what happens is from that brace front leg, the trunk then drives forward, and in simplistic terms, the bowling arm is almost left behind. So the trunk pulls through, and the bowling arm then gets dragged through afterwards, and it's sort of that transfer of momentum or energy, however you want to describe it, that sort of whiplash-like type movement, a kinetic chain, etc., that takes that energy through to the ball.
Is that the same for male and female cricketers, or have you done much kind of research in both male and female cricket?
So certainly in the first instance, a lot of the work was all on the male fast bowlers, and there's been a series of projects there. But males and females are different. Fundamentally, their strength characteristics are very different. And so on one level, you might think they bowl very similarly. But equally they could be quite different. And so more recently we've had a project that Hannah Jowett is now currently doing, which is to try and take all of that learning we've done on the male side of the game and saying, well, how is it different, or how is it the same for the female fast bowler? We're seeing fast bowlers on the female side bowling, high 70s, I think now. And, they're a bit behind in terms of learning, but equally they've been coached probably in the same way as male fast bowlers to date, and that might not be appropriate. So I think the jury's still out, if I'm honest, but I think there are going to be some characteristics the same, but there might be some subtle differences too.
And how do you actually go about answering those questions then? We've probably jumped to the end where we've spoken a lot about results, but when the players actually come into the lab, what does a typical elite cricket biomechanics testing session look like?
Yeah, well, what you're wanting to do is for them to do what they do best, which is to bolt fast. And you're trying to do that in the controlled environment of a laboratory. And so you try and make it as natural as possible for them. So in the early days on these projects, we didn't have our own biomechanics lab to do this. So we used to spend hours and hours, and you're well aware of that, setting kit up in their environment. So we had a portable motion capture system. So that took a team of people, students typically, to set the kit up, hope nothing broke, and most of the time it didn't. And then you want them to just do what they do naturally, but then you're sticking all of these reflective markers all over them. So it's, we've shown that the data is representative of what happens out in the field. So we get good data, but fundamentally we just want them to do what they do. And we just want to record that as accurately as we can. And that gives us a starting position, because it shows us what they're doing. And then if we use some statistics, we can say on average, what are the better ones doing? What's the relationship between speed and technique? And that's what biomechanics is. And that's why fast bowling is such a nice topic area, because speed is your primary outcome. Yes, there's bounce, swing, seam, etc. But fundamentally, at the heart of it is speed.
So do you have to test lower level players in order to distinguish elite from lower level, or is it simply kind of characterizing elite and saying, what do they all do?
So you need a range, for this to work. So if all of your data points, they were all bowling at 80 miles an hour, you've got no breadth or width of information to pull something out. But equally, if you go too far away from elite, so say we took me and you bowling, Stuart, I don't know, at 45 miles an hour if we're lucky.
You'd be lucky if I got to that, I think. But,
well, yeah. We know about your shoulders. You want a group that's as equal as possible, but with a range of outcomes. That's your ideal, your perfect experiment. So, all of the bowlers we've tested would be classed as relatively elite fast bowlers or elite fast bowlers. But there's a difference in speed. We probably see, something around 15 miles per hour difference in outcome across them. And every one of those fast bowlers, if they could bowl faster, I'm pretty sure they would.
And then if that's kind of lower level and higher level athletes, the thing we haven't mentioned yet in a similar vein is age. I know you've done some work around junior bowlers. What does that look like? Are you able to kind of work with junior bowlers on the way up and help that developmental process? Are they the same, I guess, as adult bowlers, but just smaller, or are there technical differences there?
So I think that's one of the unanswered questions at the moment. So yes, we did a study looking at the pitch length for junior cricketers. This was a unique piece of work, I guess, because it was around a very specific question. But this was an example of where the England and Wales Cricket Board came to us and said, we want to do some science and research to get this right, because the recognition was that it was too far for the young bowlers to bowl to the other end of the pitch. Interestingly, Australia approached this problem in a different way. Not that it's always about England versus Australia, but, they just guessed for one, but then they changed it a few times. Whereas we tried to, through a PhD project to work out what on average is the best length of the pitch for different cricketers. And the premise here, and there's still a bit of work we're doing at the moment, was to say we want the release point for the bowling action to be the same as you mature and as you grow. So what
do you mean by release point?
Okay, so this is the
height. Or?
No. So this is the position of the bowling arm. So if you look from side on, where is the bowling arm as you let go of the ball? What we were seeing too much in junior cricket was they were almost throwing hand grenades. So the ball was having to go up before it went down. Whereas bowling, the ball, normally at the elite end goes down. Sometimes for spin bowlers it will go up a bit. For fast bowling, it will, so it's released below the horizontal. But we weren't seeing that in junior cricket. And so the discussion, and it's still a discussion point now as you learn and as you progress, was, if bowlers are having to adjust their release point, and this is a millisecond in time, it's an instant in time, that's not helping them learn necessarily how to get good control of that release point, as it's so critical. And so that's, that was a nice piece of work that was based around getting that release point the same. The interesting thing from there was that everything about the junior game got better. So it wasn't just the bowlers that had better technique. The batters could take a quick single because they could see the other end of the pitch, in inverted commas, and thought they could. And then the fielders were more involved. The game became quicker. So I think the positive outcome of that wasn't just about bowling. It actually was all facets of cricket for juniors. And so that was implemented up and down the land.
Yeah, it's really nice that there's tangible benefits there where you can actually see in the real world a difference before your eyes. But I think also probably quite a nice combination of experimental and almost theoretical what would happen type of questions, which brings me on to maybe the different ways of looking at the bowling performance studies as well, because everything you've said so far involves getting people in a lab and measuring what they actually do right now. Whereas I guess what would be really interesting is to know what could this person do in the future? Or, there are two possible ways of changing their technique. Which one would have the best effect on that person? So are there any ways of answering those almost unmeasurable questions?
Yeah, absolutely. And that leads nicely onto the next piece of work that Paul Felton did. So we've at Loughborough had a track record in using computer simulation models to investigate questions theoretically. My supervisor, Fred Eden, had done simulations of twisting somersaults that's well respected around the world. And I'd built models of gymnastics activities and incorporated strength of athletes into those models. And so a natural progression as we were looking at fast bowling was to say, okay, theoretically, what does optimum look like? And so we applied the skills we'd learnt on previous simulation projects to build essentially a computer game of fast bowling. But the difference between a computer game and the modelling work we do, or the theoretical work we do, is that these models are realistic. So we show that the model can do what the real athlete can do. And then we can investigate what would happen if they ran up faster, they were stronger, they changed their technique. And so we're not limited to what someone actually does. And so, that was, very powerfully used by the ECB, Kevin Shine and Paul Felton primarily, to look at the fast bowlers coming through and to say, okay, how could they change their technique? How could we coach fast bowling in a better way? And that was very unique and very well respected around the world.
When you say it was applied in that setting, do you know any details on how that was actually applied or what that looked like? How you go from kind of what I'm imagining an almost cartoon image on your computer screen through to an actual training intervention in the real world?
So, I think, there's a difference between what we do in research and what we do in practice. And, if you think a typical research project takes 3 to 4 years, well, the athlete's retired before you've even got your first result. So there's a real challenge there. And so on the back of the PhD, which we did to say we can model fast bowling, we then embarked on an ambitious journey of saying, okay, could we in 2 or 3 months take some bowlers, model them using the techniques we've developed, and then provide that information back to the coach to help him then make the decision on how to coach that bowler and the player. And we did that very successfly with the ECB for a few years. And, you look back on that and you say that's very unique because that's really taking very high-level computer theoretical work all the way through to the coalface. And time is the challenge there because it's not easy.
And what about forces? So if you're running in, I know you said not quite as fast as you possibly can, but you're running in very fast. You're then essentially slamming your foot into the ground. You describe the importance of a braced front knee. That sounds painful. Is it necessary to have really high forces going through the body during these actions?
So I think the answer to this question has changed over this last 19 plus years in that, you're absolutely right. There's high forces. Some fast bowlers have up to 8 times their body weight going up through their front leg. And others who are bowling very similarly, maybe have got 4 body weights going through their leg, so half as much. And so naturally you'd think that, 4 body weights must be much better if the outcome's the same. And I think there is some truth in that. The question, though, is, what's the effect of that force on the body? Because we can measure externally what's happening, but it's not so easy to measure what's happening within the body and what the effect of that force has on the body. And so some of this force might potentially be good or not as harmful as first thought. And so, we've had a project more recently looking at trying to understand, and linked to some of your early work as well, Stuart, saying what happens to that force? Where does it get to in the body? And does it have some of the negative effects that perhaps, it's thought it could? Because high force in its own, the body's quite good at coping with high force. So it's not an obvious answer, or it's not as straightforward an answer. And I think, we're coming to the conclusion that, if you think the worst injury for a fast bowler is a stress fracture in the lower back, and, does someone who's at 8 body weights coming through the front leg, more likely to get a stress fracture or not? And the project that Pete Alway did would suggest no, it doesn't have that big effect. I think there's still more work to be done on this, and it's, that's the nature of research. You understand to a level, but then you ask more questions and new techniques become available. But I would say at this point in time, if all else was equal, lower force is better, but it maybe isn't such a red flag that it perhaps was at one point in the last 19 years.
Are there any red flags then, or is there a certain technique? Could you watch a game of junior cricket, see someone running up and bowling a particular way and, get a lump in your throat thinking, oh dear, that looks bad?
Apart from if they're chucking it, which maybe we'll come on to. But, so yes, I think that the answer to that question is there are some techniques, and Pete Alway's work was really strong in this, looking at technique and injury. Taking a large cohort of about 50 bowlers, prospectively looking at that group, collecting all of the data, and then seeing which ones got injured, and then trying to relate that back to technique. And there are a couple of positions in the bowling action, one at back foot contact and one at front foot contact, where, an angle at the hip or knee in the body has been highly linked to getting stress fracture, to the point where I think over 90% of the injuries were explained by just those couple of factors. So the question is, how do you use that information? And that's where we are at the moment. How can we encourage younger bowlers not to have those techniques that are highly linked to injury, but also allow them to, achieve their potential? So I don't think there's any evidence to suggest the things that we're seeing that are linked to injury are stopping performance. And so one of the questions now going forward is, well, why are bowlers choosing those positions and those techniques? And maybe it's just that, the human body doesn't know that that's likely to get an injury in the future. So it's getting to the point now where we have a pretty decent understanding of what's happening. The question is, how can we best use that information to help cricketers going forward? And the reality is, at the elite end, if someone's already an elite bowler, you're not going to change technique massively. But what you can do is inform the next generation of young bowlers coming through so that they're far less likely to get injured, and so they can stay playing the game.
How does that work then in terms of interventions, if someone either has been injured, is diagnosed or predicted at being at risk of injury, or just has one of those techniques that you've just described? If at the elite level you're saying you probably don't want to change what they're doing too much, what can we do? Are you, recommending they bowl less? Are you recommending, they bowl less in matches, or they do whatever they need in matches and bowl less in training?
Well, injuries aren't due to one thing. So, they're multifactorial. Genetics in itself plays a part. Some people are more resilient to, more robust than others, but also nutrition, strength and conditioning, workload, etc. And so some of those factors are modifiable. And so if you've got someone who's maybe got a technique that we know is highly likely to get injured, then maybe the recommendation to the coach and the player is perhaps they should bowl less or look after themselves better with their strength and conditioning program or their nutrition. And indeed, one of our current projects that Sarah Worsdale's doing is looking at the physical characteristics of fast bowlers now, and how does that link to stress fracture? There's been an incredible change in the physiology of fast bowlers, I would say, from when we first started through till now. Not that they weren't elite 20 years ago, but they look better conditioned now. And I think so the general conditioning of fast bowling is much better now, and they're very much professional athletes. But actually, can we do better than that? And that's where, the sort of, excitement from me comes with the ECB, is that the ECB are willing to invest because they want to know more. We want to have a more specific, a better answer to that question around physical characteristics. So that's one of the modifiable factors, as well as nutrition, as well as workload, that you can change to try and mitigate and try and minimise the risk of a bowler getting injured.
And that's really interesting, because as you were speaking, I was thinking, on a really fundamental level, injury, you've got kind of the load going through a tissue, whatever that means and however it's measured, versus, the ability of that tissue to withstand it. At some point, if A is greater than B, we might be in trouble. And all of the technique stuff is probably just, linked to the load going through it. But actually, are some people better able to cope with that than others? Or, as you said earlier, if we both ran in and bowled, would my threshold for getting injured be lower than yours? But then going back to what you said earlier, if just the technique factors can explain such a massive percentage of that injury occurrence, then perhaps it is maybe a bit more simple. I don't know if there's even a question in there, but just kind of thinking out loud, it's interesting and really interesting that you're now starting to look at how that physical conditioning links with the technique and everything else.
So what I would say is that in the past, it might have been one guideline for everybody. In terms of, we don't want a bowler bowling more than, X number of overs in a week. And that might be the same for everybody. Whereas now, with the understanding we've got, I think the answer to that question can be more individualised. And I think that's the journey we're going on at the moment, is how do you make this more individual? And at the elite end, there's the opportunity to do that. At lower end, with the masses in the country, I don't think that will be so easy to do, although we're looking to see how we can make that sort of knowledge available to all going forwards. But at the elite end, there's definitely an opportunity to be much more individual in what we do.
Yes, that, I guess, makes your job a lot harder, but it's relatively simple, I imagine, to test a group of people, say, here's the result on average, let's recommend everybody does that. If you're now saying that different people might have a different optimum technique or a different relationship to injury risk, then I guess that becomes a lot harder. But does that, with the elite level and the greater availability of players and data, etc., does that then require lots of different trials and lots of different testing on the same athlete to try and understand what are they doing differently when it works versus when it doesn't? Or how do you go about, really trying to individualize something beyond just one data point that says this is what they do?
Yeah. I think it's, there's a combination of things, but fundamentally, we're now in a position, because we have such a big data set going over 20 years, which is pretty unique in sport, to start to really challenge that data set and look at it with different perspectives. So I'm sure we'll talk about AI at some point, but what have we not spotted? What can we pull out? If we've got all of this data on Jimmy Anderson, the next Jimmy Anderson coming through, when we see those similar characteristics or whatever, how can we better manage that individual, etc. And I think it's just that because we've got such a big data set now, we're able to be more, inquisitive, look at it in much more an individual basis.
You mentioned AI, so before we jump into what the future might look like for biomechanics research and cricket, one other thing that you've mentioned a couple of times I wanted to come back to was chucking, or kind of legality of bowling. So I guess the simple question, what is chucking? And then really, what does chucking have to do with your work in Loughborough?
Yeah, so, what is chucking and what is throwing? Well, there's a line in the sand for bowling which says you can't extend your arm too much. And, and the actual angle's 15 degrees and the period is between upper arm horizontal and ball release. So you can't baseball pitch in cricket, in simple terms. And because there's a line in the sand, there needs to be people who make a judgment on that. And that's what biomechanics is about. It's about measuring angles during a movement. And so, soon after we got involved in cricket and started working in cricket, there was a bowler identified by umpires as thought to be chucking. And so we were asked to do the testing of that as we were based, alongside the National Cricket Centre. And from there, we then became accredited by the ICC, and we've tested lots of bowlers over the years. It's a really hard thing. I don't enjoy doing it at all because, you're not ending someone's career, but, putting a hold on their career for a period while they try and improve. And what I'm trying to now do more of is to say, how can we help bowlers who are the wrong side of the line, who are extending their elbow too much? And that's, again, taking what we know and then working with coaches to give the right feedback to ultimately try and eradicate this from the game. And it's not an easy process because the bowling arm or the human naturally wants to try and do everything they can to bowl the ball as well as they can, and they don't know about 15 degrees. And so if you extend your elbow, you can bowl faster. And so you're working against what your body wants to naturally do.
Yeah, if you're able to talk about it, or as much as you're able to talk about, what does that process look like? So the Ashes are going on at the moment. If an umpire suspects something of a bowler, what's the process between something going off in an umpire's mind and that player ending up in a biomechanics laboratory somewhere in the world?
Yeah. I mean, umpires are the starting point. So, a player would get, there would be a query from an umpire. The regulations would then ultimately refer that player to us. It's all done confidentially now, so it's not out in the public domain. But if it was an English player, we wouldn't test them. They would have to go overseas. There's a lot less of it. And 10 years ago, there was a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of the elite bowlers were bowling inappropriately, but the ICC were very proactive around that period and, got on top of that with a number of accredited laboratories around the world.
And when you say there are a number of accredited laboratories around the world, do they all test in the same way then? So if I went and bowled at 3 or 4 different places in 3 or 4 different continents, in theory, should you get the exact same number every time? Or are there differences in kind of the methods and processes that different labs employ?
So 20 years ago, there absolutely were differences. It was left to the biomechanist to fundamentally, decide how to answer this question. And there were a number of different methods. So if you went to a lab in Australia or came here, we'd do it differently. The ICC were very proactive around the early sort of 2010, 2011, etc., and said we need a common methodology. So we were part of that process with researchers in Australia primarily, as we were the 2 sort of big groups that were doing testing. And, the ICC developed a methodology that these, I think it's 5 or possibly 6 labs around the world now use. So yes, trying to give confidence that if you came to Loughborough or you came to Chennai or went to Brisbane, etc., you'd get the same answer.
So moving on from legality and potentially slightly less the maybe less controversial topics, but you touched on AI earlier. What do you think the future holds for this area? Kind of in 5 or 10 years' time, if we would have this conversation again, elite cricket bowling biomechanics, where do you think we'll be? And what do you think the future holds?
So I think a lot of the research currently is primarily based out of laboratories. Technology is changing so fast. I mean, back in 2004, the first time we'd used a motion capture system with, marker-based system was for cricket. Now we're probably at a juncture where at some point in the future, the laboratories themselves will change, so that markers stuck on the body won't be needed. There are companies out there essentially tracking human movement with lots of cameras, but no markers on the body. So the technology is changing massively. But then you also look at your smartphone in your pocket and you think, well, the recording capabilities of that from a video perspective are so much better than when I did my PhD, with cinefilm, etc. And so technology is moving very quickly, and it's going to make biomechanics available to many more people. The danger is, what's the right biomechanics to help people? Or that's the risk here, because there's a danger that we'll have just too much information. So YouTube is a classic example. People will try and learn, see videos on YouTube, and then they'll try and apply that to themselves. I think the future is you'll be able to record yourself or get data on yourself automatically, and then be able to use that information through apps, etc., to help people on their journeys. So in other words, what's available to the elite becomes hopefully available to many more people. And that's the sort of things we're trying to do now. Is we've got all of this knowledge. We work very closely with the England cricket team. How do we take that knowledge to help people on their journeys to be the best they can in sport, in a cost-effective way? Because not everybody can afford the sort of coaching that the best can have.
If anyone is listening and thinks that sounds great, or even just any of the things you've spoken about, people that want to find out more, or someone that's competing at whatever level and wants to improve their own performance or try and avoid injuries, where can they find out more, or what can they maybe do to try and apply some of this to themselves?
So certainly, obviously, people can get in touch with me directly, but we've also got a little spin out from Loughborough. I'm not sure how much I can say, but anyway, so it's called Donetic, and this is, recognising that we've got all of this knowledge and trying to make it available to all. And so there's a website, which I'm sure we can put in, link into the podcast somehow, and people can look there. But this is very early doors, for that at the moment. It's about taking that knowledge and making it available to all through smartphones, using pose estimation, etc. And I think we're not the only people trying to do it. And I suspect over this next few years, there's going to be an explosion of this sort of thing because the technology is now available. I think what we're trying to do is always have a science-based approach at the heart of that. So it's not my opinion on some of this. It's coming from the research, from the science, and then how do we apply that to all?
On that note then, if I am an end user of those kind of systems, if there is an explosion, and I think we're seeing this in all sorts of domains at the moment, if there are 20 different options out there claiming to do similar things, any advice on how I do figure out which one is potentially the most robust or the most evidence informed?
I think that's a hard question. It's a bit like, if you've got a problem at home, you need a plumber. Which plumber do you find? I think you just have to, look. I mean, where we're coming from is we're trying to work with the national governing body, and use the information we've got there to make available to all. And so, hopefully that shows that we've got a research heart to what we're doing. Because every person has an opinion. One of the things about coaching is that every coach has a different opinion on something. We're trying to have an evidence, science-based approach to that. And that seems to be the right thing.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming on the podcast. And I look forward to seeing what the next 19 years or so has in store. Thank you, Stuart.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@loughborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.